The wagon wheel hit the rock at precisely the wrong angle, and everything Beatrice Whitmore owned went flying through the Arizona dust as the entire rig flipped sideways and crashed down on top of her with a sickening crunch that knocked every bit of air from her lungs. Superior, Arizona had been visible on the horizon just minutes before, a collection of buildings shimmering in the October heat of 1883, so close she could almost taste the cool water she'd been dreaming about for the last 20 miles. Now all she could see was the splintered underside of her wagon and a sliver of impossibly blue sky through the gap where her left arm was pinned. The weight pressing down on her chest made breathing nearly impossible, and she couldn't tell if the wetness on her face was blood or sweat or tears. Probably all three. Her horse had bolted the moment the wagon tipped, taking her only hope of help with it, and the road stretched empty in both directions as far as she could see from her limited vantage point. Pain radiated through her ribs with each shallow breath she managed, and Beatrice tried not to think about how her father had died under similar circumstances 3 years ago, when his mining equipment had collapsed on him in Colorado. She'd promised herself then that she'd be more careful, that she'd pay attention to every detail, but apparently watching for rocks in the road hadn't been high enough on her list. The irony of dying the same way he had, alone and crushed, made her want to laugh, except that laughing would require air she didn't have. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel her lips cracking as she tried to call out for help that wouldn't come. This stretch of road between Phoenix and Superior saw maybe 3 travelers a day if the weather was good, and most people had enough sense not to travel in the afternoon heat. Beatrice closed her eyes and tried to conserve what little strength she had left, tried not to panic about the fact that she couldn't feel her left leg anymore. Then she heard hoofbeats. They were distant at first, could have been a trick of her fading consciousness, but they grew steadily louder until she was certain someone was approaching. Beatrice tried to call out but only managed a weak croak that wouldn't carry more than a few feet. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped, and she heard boots hitting the ground with a purposeful thud. Jesus Christ! The voice was male, deep, and closer than she'd expected. "Madam, can you hear me?" "Yes," Beatrice managed, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Don't move. I'm going to get this off you." The voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that suggested its owner had dealt with emergencies before and hadn't panicked yet. Beatrice heard him moving around the wagon, muttering to himself as he assessed the situation. "This is going to take some doing." "Can you tell me where you're hurt?" "Everywhere," Beatrice said honestly. "Can't breathe right, can't feel my left leg." "All right. I'm going to lift this wagon up enough for you to crawl out. When I say move, you move as fast as you can, understand? I can't hold it long." Beatrice wanted to argue that she couldn't move at all, that her body felt like it had been trampled by a dozen horses, but she didn't have the breath for it. Instead, she just said, "Okay." She heard him position himself, heard him take several deep breaths, and then he said, "Ready. 1, 2, 3. The wagon groaned and shifted, and suddenly there was light and air and blessed relief as the crushing weight lifted off her chest. For a split second, Beatrice just lay there drinking in oxygen like a drowning person breaching the surface, but then his voice cut through the haze with urgent command. "Move now." Her body responded before her mind fully processed the order, scrambling and dragging herself across the rough ground, even though every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her battered frame. She'd barely cleared the wagon's shadow when she heard him grunt with effort, and the wagon crashed back down exactly where she'd been lying moments before. Beatrice collapsed onto her back in the dirt, staring up at the impossibly blue sky while her rescuer came into view, blocking out the sun as he crouched beside her. She had a confused impression of dark hair, sun-bronzed skin, and eyes the color of creek water before he started running his hands along her arms and legs with practiced efficiency. "I'm checking for breaks," he said when she flinched. "Need to know what we're dealing with before I move you again." "What's your name?" Beatrice Whitmore. She watched his face as he worked, noting the strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, the lines around his eyes that suggested he spent most of his time squinting into the sun. He couldn't have been more than 25 or 26, young enough that his hands were still steady and sure as they probed her injuries. "Who are you?" "Quinton Irons. I've got a ranch about 10 miles south of Superior." His fingers pressed gently along her ribs and she gasped. "Ribs are likely cracked but not broken through the skin. That's good. Can you move your left leg?" Beatrice tried and was relieved when her toes responded, even if the movement sent shooting pains up her thigh. Yes, it was numb before, but feelings coming back. Also good. "Means nothing severed." Quinton sat back on his heels and pulled a canteen from his belt, uncapping it and holding it to her lips. "Slow sips. Not too much at once or you'll just bring it back up." The water was the most glorious thing Beatrice had ever tasted, even warm and slightly metallic from the canteen. She forced herself to follow his instructions, even though she wanted to drain the entire container. When he pulled it away, she found herself studying him more carefully. He wore the practical clothes of a working rancher, his shirt dusty and worn but clean, his hat tilted back to reveal a face that was more interesting than handsome, with a nose that had clearly been broken at least once, and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "Thank you," Beatrice said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I thought I was going to die out here." "You nearly did." Quinton glanced at the overturned wagon, then back at her. "What were you doing traveling alone in this heat, and where were you headed?" "Superior." "I've got a teaching position starting next week at the new school." Beatrice tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as her ribs screamed in protest. Quinton's hand came down on her shoulder, gentle but firm, keeping her in place. "Don't try to move yet. Give your body a minute to remember it's still alive." He looked back at the wagon again, frowning. "A teacher. That explains the books I saw scattered everywhere. You lose anything important. Everything I own is in that wagon." Beatrice felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She'd cried enough over the past 3 years since her father's death, since she'd lost the house in Denver and had to sell everything to pay his debts. She'd spent the last of her savings on this wagon and the supplies inside it, on the journey to Arizona where she'd been promised a fresh start. "But I suppose I can replace things easier than I can replace my life." Quinton's expression softened slightly. "That's the right way to look at it." "Can you tell me what hurts the most?" "My ribs where the wagon was pressing. My left arm feels scraped raw. My head is pounding." Beatrice took inventory of her injuries as she spoke, relieved that nothing seemed catastrophic. "I'm lucky you came along when you did." Lucky is one word for it. Quinton stood and walked back to the wagon, circling it slowly. "Your wheel is completely shattered. Even if we could flip this back over, you wouldn't be going anywhere, and your horse ran off, probably halfway to Phoenix by now. So what do I do?" Beatrice finally managed to push herself up to sitting, moving slowly and carefully. From this angle, she could see the full extent of the disaster. Her clothes were scattered across the road, her books lying open with their pages fluttering in the hot breeze, her dishes shattered into 1,000 pieces. 3 years of rebuilding her life, and it had all come apart in seconds. Quinton returned to her side and held out his hand. "First thing we do is get you out of this sun before you cook. I've got my horse and enough supplies to get us both to Superior. We'll have to ride double, and it's not going to be comfortable with those ribs, but we don't have much choice. Come dark, Scavengers will pick this wagon clean." Beatrice hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. She didn't know this man, had no reason to trust him beyond the fact that he'd just saved her life, but what choice did she have? She certainly couldn't stay here, and she couldn't walk 10 miles to town in her condition. His grip was warm and calloused as he helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "Easy," Quinton said. "Let me know if you feel like you're going to pass out. I'm all right." Beatrice wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she forced herself to stay upright through sheer stubbornness. She'd come too far to collapse now. "Can we save anything from the wagon?" "My teaching materials, at least." Quinton looked at her for a long moment, and Beatrice had the strange sensation that he was reassessing his initial impression of her. Then he nodded. "We'll take what we can carry." "Show me what's most important." They spent the next 20 minutes salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Beatrice's carefully packed trunk had burst open, but most of her clothes were intact if dusty. Quinton tied them into a bundle using one of her shawls. Her books were in worse shape, but he helped her gather the ones that seemed most crucial, wrapping them in a blanket and securing the bundle to his saddle. Her dishes were a total loss, as was most of her food, but Quinton assured her none of that would be hard to replace in Superior. "The town's been booming since they opened the Silver Queen mine last year," he said as he worked. "You'll be able to buy whatever you need, though I won't lie to you, prices are steep. I have some money saved." Not much, but hopefully enough to tide her over until she received her first month's salary. Beatrice watched him secure the bundles to his horse, a sturdy bay mare who stood patiently despite the added weight. "Will your horse be able to carry both of us plus all this?" "Rosie's stronger than she looks." Quinton patted the mare's neck affectionately. "She's carried heavier loads over worse terrain. It's only 10 miles and we'll take it slow." He turned to Beatrice and studied her carefully. "You sure you're up for this? It's going to hurt." "Everything already hurts." Beatrice squared her shoulders, ignoring the way the movement made her ribs throb. "I can handle 10 more miles." "Stubborn," Quinton said, but there was something like approval in his voice. He swung up into the saddle first, then held down his hand. "Put your foot in the stirrup, and I'll pull you up. Try not to use your ribs if you can help it." Getting onto the horse was every bit as difficult and painful as Beatrice had anticipated, but between her determination and Quinton's strength, she managed to settle behind him in the saddle. He pulled her arms around his waist without asking, positioning her so she could lean against his back for support. "Hold on tight," he said. "If you feel dizzy or sick, tell me immediately. Last thing we need is you falling off and cracking your head open." Beatrice nodded against his shoulder blade, too focused on breathing through the pain to form words. The horse started forward at a gentle walk, and even that modest pace sent jolts of agony through her battered body. She closed her eyes and tried to think about something, anything else. About the teaching position waiting for her in Superior, the fresh start she'd been promised. About the children she'd be educating, the difference she might make in their lives. About the solid warmth of the man in front of her, and the way his heartbeat was steady beneath her pressed palms. "You still with me back there?" Quinton asked after they'd been riding for several minutes. "Yes." Beatrice forced her eyes open, squinting against the bright sunlight. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, all red rock and scattered scrub brush beneath that endless blue sky. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still visible despite the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. "How long have you lived in Arizona?" "About 3 years. Came out from Texas after my father died and left me enough money to buy some land." Quinton's voice was matter-of-fact, but Beatrice caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "Started the ranch from nothing." "It's not much yet, just me and a couple of hired hands running cattle, but it's mine. My father died 3 years ago too, Beatrice heard herself say. Mining accident in Colorado, he didn't leave me anything but debts. I'm sorry. Quinton half turned his head, not enough to look at her but enough that she could see his profile. That's rough. No other family. My mother died when I was 12. No siblings, just me. Beatrice had said those words so many times over the past 3 years that they'd lost their sting, become simple facts rather than sources of pain. That's why I came to Arizona. Nothing left for me in Colorado. Well, Superior's not a bad place to start over. Quinton urged Rosie up a slight incline, keeping the pace deliberately slow. It's rough like any mining town, but there are decent people there. And they've been wanting a proper teacher for the school. The last one was a drunk who spent more time at the saloon than in the classroom. That's a low bar to clear. Beatrice managed a weak smile despite everything. I promise I'll at least show up sober. Quinton made a sound that might have been a laugh. You've already got my vote then. They fell into a comfortable silence after that. Nothing but the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the occasional call of a bird breaking the quiet. Beatrice found herself relaxing despite her injuries, lulled by the gentle swaying motion and the solid presence of Quinton in front of her. She'd been so focused on just surviving the past 3 years, on making it from one day to the next, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to trust someone else to carry some of the weight. The sun was lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, when Superior finally came into full view. It was bigger than Beatrice had expected, a sprawling collection of buildings clustered around the mine with side streets branching off in all directions. She could see the church steeple rising above the other structures, the false-fronted buildings lining what must be the main street, the scattered houses spreading up into the hills. There's a doctor in town, Quinton said as they approached. Dr. Sarah Chen. She's good, knows what she's doing. I'm taking you straight there. I can't afford a doctor right now. Beatrice's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, born of embarrassment and fear. I need to save what money I have for replacing my supplies. Consider it part of the rescue. Quinton's tone left no room for argument. You've got cracked ribs at minimum, possibly a concussion, and who knows what else. You're not going to be much good as a teacher if you collapse in front of your students' first day. He had a point, much as Beatrice hated to admit it. She let her forehead rest against his back and didn't argue further as they rode into town. People stopped to stare as they passed, and Beatrice was suddenly, painfully aware of what they must look like. Her covered in dust and blood, clinging to a man she'd just met, both of them looking like they'd been dragged behind a stagecoach. That's Quinton Irons, she heard someone mutter. Wonder what trouble he's gotten himself into now. Looks like he found trouble, more like, another voice responded. That poor woman looks half dead. Quinton ignored the whispers and rode straight to a tidy building near the center of town with a sign out front reading Dr. S. Chen, physician. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Beatrice down, catching her when her legs buckled beneath her. I've got you, he said quietly, and somehow Beatrice believed him. Dr. Chen turned out to be a small, efficient woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and gentle hands. She took one look at Beatrice and immediately ushered them into her examination room, firing questions at Quinton about what had happened while she helped Beatrice onto the table. Overturned wagon about 10 miles out, Quinton explained. She was trapped underneath for at least 15 minutes before I found her. I lifted it off and checked for obvious breaks, but I'm not qualified to do more than that. You did well. Dr. Chen was already unbuttoning Beatrice's dusty dress, her movements quick and professional. Miss Whitmore, I need to examine your injuries properly. Mr. Irons, you can wait outside." "I'll be right out front," Quinton said, catching Beatrice's eye for just a moment. Something passed between them, some wordless reassurance, and then he was gone and Beatrice was alone with the doctor. The examination was thorough and uncomfortable. Dr. Chen confirmed Quinton's assessment of cracked ribs, adding that Beatrice had extensive bruising across her torso and a mild concussion. Her left arm was badly scraped but not broken, her left leg bruised but functional. All things considered, she'd been extraordinarily lucky. "You need to rest for at least a week," Dr. Chen said firmly as she wrapped Beatrice's ribs with strips of clean cloth. "No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity. Those ribs need time to heal properly or you'll end up with permanent damage." "Do you have somewhere to stay in town? I was supposed to board with the schoolmaster's family." Beatrice winced as the binding tightened. "A Mr. Harold Peterson and his wife. I have their address. The Petersons are good people. I'll send word to them about your condition. Doctor." Chen helped Beatrice sit up slowly. "Now, about payment. My usual fee for this kind of examination and treatment is $5. $5 was more than Beatrice had wanted to spend, but it was fair for the care she'd received. She nodded and reached for the small purse she still had tied around her waist, one of the few things that had stayed with her through the accident. "I can pay that. Already taken care of," Dr. Chen said, surprising her. "Mr. Irons paid when he came in. Said it was the least he could do after you'd had such a rough day." Beatrice felt a complicated mix of gratitude and embarrassment wash over her. She'd been taking care of herself for 3 years now, had gotten used to handling everything on her own. Having someone else step in to help felt strange and uncomfortable and wonderful all at once. That was very kind of him. Quinton's a good man, for all that he keeps to himself most of the time. Dr. Chen studied Beatrice with those sharp eyes. "You're lucky he was the one who found you. Not everyone would have taken the trouble to help, especially not this time of year when everyone's busy preparing for winter." "I know." Beatrice looked down at her hands, noting the scrapes and bruises covering her knuckles. "I don't know how I'm going to repay him." "I suspect he doesn't expect repayment." Dr. Chen moved to the door. "Let me get Mr. Irons back in here. He's probably wearing a hole in my floorboards with his pacing." Sure enough, when Dr. Chen opened the door, Quinton was there immediately, his hat in his hands and worry clear on his face. "How is she?" "She'll live, thanks to your quick thinking." Dr. Chen stood aside to let him enter. "But she needs rest and care for at least a week. Can you take her to the Peterson house? I'll follow shortly with some medicine for the pain." "Of course." Quinton moved to Beatrice's side, offering his arm. "Can you walk? Or should I carry you?" The thought of being carried through the streets of Superior was mortifying enough that Beatrice forced herself to stand, leaning heavily on Quinton's offered arm. "I can walk." It was slow going, but between Quinton's support and her own stubborn determination, Beatrice made it outside and back onto his horse. This time, when he pulled her up behind him, she didn't hesitate to wrap her arms around his waist and lean against his back. The pain medicine Dr. Chen had given her before they left was already starting to work, making everything feel slightly fuzzy around the edges. "Thank you," Beatrice said quietly as they rode through town, "for everything. For saving my life, for the doctor, for all of it. Anyone would have done the same." Quinton's voice was gruff, almost embarrassed. "No," Beatrice said with certainty. "They wouldn't have. But you did." The Peterson house was a cheerful yellow building on the edge of town with a neat garden out front and lace curtains in the windows. A woman in her 40s came bustling out before Quinton even had a chance to dismount, her face creased with concern. "You must be Miss Whitmore. Dr. Chen's boy just brought word about your accident." "Oh, you poor dear. What a terrible welcome to Superior. She helped Beatrice down from the horse with surprising strength, clucking over her injuries like a mother hen. I'm Martha Peterson, and you just don't worry about a thing. We've got a lovely room all ready for you, and I'll bring up some soup once you're settled. Beatrice found herself swept into the house on a tide of Martha's well-meaning fussing, barely managing to look back and mouth another thank you to Quinton before she was inside. She caught a glimpse of him tipping his hat to her before he turned Rosie back toward the street, and then Martha was guiding her up a narrow staircase to a small but comfortable bedroom. Now you just rest, Martha said, helping Beatrice onto the bed with careful hands. Harold and I are so glad to have you here, even if the circumstances aren't what we'd hoped. The children have been so excited about having a real teacher, but that can all wait until you're feeling better. Right now, you just focus on healing. Beatrice wanted to protest, to say that she needed to prepare for the school year, to replace her lost supplies, to do 100 things. But the medicine was making her drowsy, and Martha's capable presence was comforting in a way she hadn't experienced since her mother died. So instead, she just nodded and let herself sink into the soft mattress, closing her eyes against the late afternoon light streaming through the window. She dreamed of strong hands lifting impossible weights, of creek water eyes filled with concern, of a voice saying, "I've got you," like a promise. The next week passed in a blur of rest and healing. Martha Peterson proved to be exactly the kind of caretaker Beatrice needed, firm about her resting but kind in every interaction. Harold Peterson, a portly man with a magnificent mustache and a passion for education, stopped by her room each evening to discuss plans for the school year, always careful not to tire her too much. Dr. Chen visited every other day to check on her progress, pronouncing herself satisfied with how Beatrice was healing. The ribs would take time, she warned, but as long as Beatrice didn't overdo it, she should be fine to start teaching in another week. Beatrice was touched by how many people in Superior stopped by to welcome her, despite having never met her before. The mayor's wife brought flowers. The owner of the general store offered her credit until she received her first salary. The minister's daughter, a shy girl of about 16, brought a stack of books to help pass the time. But the person Beatrice found herself thinking about most was the one who didn't visit at all. "I haven't seen Quinton Irons since he brought you here," Beatrice said to Martha on the 5th day, trying to sound casual and probably failing. "Is his ranch very busy this time of year?" Martha paused in her tidying of the room, giving Beatrice a knowing look. "Quinton keeps to himself mostly. Comes into town for supplies once a month or so, doesn't socialize much. Some folks think he's standoffish, but I think he's just private. Lost his mother when he was young, you know, and his father was a hard man by all accounts. I don't think Quinton learned much about opening up to people. But he helped me." Beatrice couldn't quite reconcile the image of a distant loner with the man who'd lifted a wagon off her, who'd paid her doctor's bills, who'd held her steady when she could barely stand. "He did," Martha agreed. "And that tells you something about who he really is, doesn't it? Actions speak louder than words, my mother always said." Beatrice thought about that a lot over the next few days. She thought about it while she was healing, while she was preparing lesson plans for her new students, while she was slowly walking the streets of Superior to rebuild her strength. She thought about steady hands and worried eyes, and the solid warmth of someone she could lean on. On the 8th day after the accident, Beatrice woke up feeling genuinely well for the first time since the wagon had crushed her. Her ribs still ached, but it was a manageable discomfort rather than the sharp agony of the first few days. She dressed carefully in one of the dresses Martha had helped her clean and mend, pinned up her dark hair, and made her way downstairs. "You look much better," Martha said approvingly over breakfast. "Got some color back in your cheeks. Still moving like you're made of glass, though." "I'm being careful," Beatrice assured her. "Dr. Chen said I could start light activities as long as I don't overdo it. I thought I'd walk into town, visit the general store, start replacing some of what I lost." "Good idea. The school opens Monday, so you'll want to be ready." Martha poured Beatrice another cup of coffee. "You know, if you wanted to ride out to Quinton's ranch to thank him properly, I'm sure Harold could draw you a map. It's not far, maybe an hour's ride if you borrowed a horse from the stable." Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Impose?" Martha laughed. "Dear girl, that man saved your life. I think he'd appreciate knowing you're all right. And besides," she added with a sly smile, "he's single, handsome enough if you like the rugged type, and he owns his own land. In a town like Superior, that makes him quite the catch, even if he doesn't seem interested in being caught." "Martha," Beatrice couldn't help laughing despite her embarrassment. "I just met him, and I'll be working as a teacher. I can't afford any hint of impropriety." "Nothing improper about thanking someone for saving your life." Martha winked. "But you do what feels right to you. I'm just saying, it might be nice is all." Beatrice thought about Martha's words as she walked into town later that morning, greeting the people she'd met over the past week. Superior was beautiful in the early morning light, the harsh edges of the buildings softened by the golden glow of sunrise. The mountains in the distance were sharp and clear against the blue sky, and despite everything she'd been through, Beatrice felt a surge of hope. This could be a good place for her. A place to build a new life, to make a difference, to finally stop running from her grief and start living again. She was coming out of the general store, her arms full of packages, when she nearly collided with someone on the wooden sidewalk. "Sorry," she said automatically, then looked up and found herself staring into creek water eyes. "Oh, Quinton." He looked startled to see her, hat in hand, his expression uncertain. "Miss Whitmore, I didn't expect to see you up and around so soon. I'm healing well, thanks to you." Beatrice adjusted her packages, suddenly nervous. She'd thought about what she'd say to him if she saw him again, had rehearsed thank yous and expressions of gratitude, but now that he was standing in front of her, all her prepared words fled. "I've been hoping to see you, actually. I never got to properly thank you. No thanks necessary." Quinton looked uncomfortable with the praise, his gaze sliding away from hers. "Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true." Beatrice took a breath, wincing slightly as her ribs protested. "You saved my life. You paid my doctor's bills. You made sure I got somewhere safe. Those aren't small things, and I won't pretend they are." Quinton was quiet for a moment, studying her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "How are you really feeling? Dr. Chen said you had cracked ribs." "I'm better. Still sore, but better." Beatrice shifted her packages again. "I start teaching on Monday. The children are apparently very excited to have a teacher who isn't drunk." That pulled a small smile from him. "You'll do well. I can tell you care about it. I do." Beatrice hesitated, then made a decision. "Would you walk with me? I'm heading back to the Petersons, and these packages are heavier than I expected." Quinton took the packages from her arms without asking, and they fell into step together. The morning was still cool, pleasant before the full heat of the day set in, and Beatrice was acutely aware of Quinton's presence beside her. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to look at him, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested years of hard physical labor. "Martha Peterson said you don't come into town much," Beatrice said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not unless I have to. Ranch keeps me busy." Quinton glanced at her sideways. "That bother you?" "Why would it bother me? Some people find it unfriendly." "Think I'm putting on airs or some such?" Beatrice considered that. "I think people are entitled to their privacy, and I think you probably have your reasons." "I do." Quinton didn't elaborate and Beatrice didn't push. They walked in silence for another minute before he said, "What made you want to be a teacher?" "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She used to tell me stories about her students, about the difference she made in their lives." Beatrice smiled at the memory. "After she died, I thought maybe I could honor her memory by doing the same thing. And after my father died and I had to start over, teaching seemed like something I could do anywhere, something that would always matter." "That's a good reason." Quinton's voice was thoughtful. "Better than most people have for their work." They reached the Peterson house too quickly. Quinton set her packages on the porch, then stood there awkwardly, hat in his hands again. Beatrice knew she should thank him and let him go, knew he probably had a dozen things to do back at his ranch, but she found herself reluctant to end the conversation. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" The invitation was out before she could second-guess it. "I'm sure Martha would love to thank you properly, and it's the least I can offer after everything." Quinton looked torn, but finally nodded. "I suppose I could spare a few minutes." Martha was delighted to see Quinton, insisting on feeding him breakfast despite his protests that he'd already eaten. She bustled around the kitchen while Beatrice and Quinton sat at the table, and Beatrice found herself relaxing into the easy conversation. Quinton talked about his ranch, about the challenges of building something from nothing, about his hopes of expanding the herd next year if the market held steady. Beatrice talked about her plans for the school, about the books she wanted to order, about her dream of starting a small library that the whole town could use. "That's ambitious," Quinton said, but he sounded impressed rather than dismissive. "This town could use more people with ambition like that." "I just want to make a difference." Beatrice traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "I spent 3 years feeling like I was just surviving, just getting from one day to the next. I want to do more than survive now. I want to build something that matters." "I understand that." Quinton met her eyes across the table, and Beatrice felt something shift between them, some recognition of shared experience and shared goals. "Building something that matters is all I've wanted since I left Texas." They talked until the sun was high overhead, until Quinton reluctantly stood and said he needed to get back to the ranch before his hired hands decided he'd abandoned them. Beatrice walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to let him go. "Will you come back?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "I mean, to town, to visit." Quinton's expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. "I might be convinced to make the trip more often, especially if there's reason to." "There's reason to," Beatrice said quietly and felt her heart race when he smiled. "Then I'll see you soon, Miss Whitmore." "Beatrice," she corrected. "If we're going to be friends, you should call me Beatrice." "Beatrice," Quinton repeated, and the way he said her name made something warm unfurl in her chest. "I'll see you soon, Beatrice." She watched him ride away on Rosie, watched until he was just a speck on the horizon, and tried to ignore Martha's knowing smile when she turned back to the house. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Beatrice woke early, nerves and excitement warring in her stomach as she prepared for her first day of teaching. Her ribs were nearly healed, just a dull ache now when she moved wrong, and her other injuries had faded to faint bruises. She dressed in her best teaching dress, pinned her hair up in a neat bun, and tried to look like someone who deserved the trust the town was placing in her. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building on the east side of town, one large room with rows of desks and a slate board at the front. It smelled of chalk dust and new wood, and Beatrice fell in love with it immediately. She spent the early morning arranging her salvaged books on the shelf, writing the day's lessons on the board, and trying to calm her racing heart. The children started arriving at 8 o'clock. There were 15 of them ranging in age from 6 to 14, children of miners and shopkeepers and ranchers, children who looked at her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Beatrice understood both emotions. She'd been the new person enough times to know how it felt. "Good morning," she said once they'd all settled into their seats. "My name is Miss Whitmore, and I'm very happy to be your new teacher. I know some of you have had bad experiences with teachers before, so I want to start by telling you what you can expect from me. I will be fair, I will be patient, and I will do everything I can to help you learn. In return, I ask that you work hard, respect each other, and don't be afraid to ask questions." "Does that sound reasonable?" A small girl in the front row, no more than 7, raised her hand timidly. "Is it true you almost died in a wagon accident? So much for starting with lessons." Beatrice smiled. "It's true that I was in an accident on my way to Superior, but I was very lucky that someone found me and helped me, and now I'm just fine. Though I'd appreciate if we could focus on learning rather than my adventures." The children laughed, and just like that, the ice was broken. The day flew by in a blur of lessons and questions and getting to know her new students. They were bright and eager, starved for real education after months with a teacher who hadn't cared. Beatrice found herself energized despite her still healing injuries, inspired by their enthusiasm. When the last child left at 3 o'clock, Beatrice sank into her chair behind the desk and let out a long breath. She'd done it. First day complete, and it had gone better than she dared hope. "Heard you had a good first day." Beatrice's head snapped up to find Quinton leaning in the doorway, hat in hand and a slight smile on his face. Her heart did a complicated flip that she tried to ignore. "Word travels fast in Superior," she said, standing to greet him. "What brings you to town?" "Had to pick up some supplies. Thought I'd stop by and see how the famous teacher was doing." Quinton stepped into the schoolroom, looking around with interest. "This is nice. Better than the school I went to in Texas." "You went to school?" Beatrice regretted the question immediately when Quinton raised an eyebrow at her. "I'm sorry, that came out wrong. I just meant that a lot of ranchers don't. My mother insisted." Quinton's expression went distant for a moment. "She died when I was 12, but she'd already taught me to read and write by then. Made my father promise to keep me in school until I was 16. It's the only promise I ever saw him keep." Beatrice's heart ached for the boy he'd been, losing his mother so young. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman." "She was." Quinton shook off the melancholy and focused on Beatrice again. "You look tired." "Teaching 15 children will do that, I suppose." "Happy tired," Beatrice corrected. "It went well. Better than I expected, honestly. The children were wonderful." "That's good." Quinton shifted his weight, looking uncertain again. "I was wondering if you might want to have dinner with me sometime." "Not tonight," he added quickly. "I know you're probably exhausted, but maybe this Saturday. There's a decent restaurant in town. Or if you'd rather not be the subject of town gossip, I could bring something out to the ranch and we could eat there." Beatrice's breath caught. This wasn't just a friendly invitation. This was Quinton asking to court her in his careful, roundabout way. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but another part hesitated. She'd only been in Superior for 2 weeks. She barely knew this man, even if he had saved her life, and she had her teaching position to think about. Teachers were expected to maintain certain standards of behavior. But then she looked at Quinton's face, at the hope and vulnerability there, and she thought about how safe she'd felt leaning against his back as they rode to town. How easy it had been to talk to him over coffee. How her heart raced every time she saw him. "Saturday at the ranch sounds perfect," Beatrice said, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed Quinton's entire face. "I'll send a buggy for you around noon," he promised, "and I'll try not to poison you with my cooking." I have faith in you." Beatrice walked him to the door, acutely aware of how much she didn't want him to leave yet. "Thank you for stopping by. Thank you for saying yes." Quinton settled his hat on his head and tipped it to her. "Have a good rest of the week, Beatrice." She watched him walk away, same as she had before, and this time she didn't even try to hide her smile. The week crept by with agonizing slowness. Beatrice threw herself into teaching, into getting to know her students and their families, into exploring Superior and learning its rhythms. She discovered that she loved the town, loved its rough vitality and the kindness of its people. She loved watching the sun rise over the mountains each morning, loved the way the desert came alive with color at sunset. But mostly, she found herself thinking about Saturday. Martha was insufferably smug about the whole thing, helping Beatrice pick out a dress and style her hair like she was preparing for a ball rather than a simple dinner at a ranch. "It's important to make a good impression," Martha insisted, pinning up a stray curl. "Quinton Irons doesn't invite just anyone to his ranch. In fact, I don't think he's ever invited anyone before." "You're not helping my nerves," Beatrice said, but she couldn't help smiling. When Saturday arrived, Beatrice was ready long before noon, pacing the Peterson house like a caged animal until Martha finally shooed her outside to wait on the porch. True to his word, Quinton arrived exactly at noon driving a small buggy pulled by Rosie. He'd cleaned up, Beatrice noticed. His hair was still damp from washing, his jaw freshly shaved, and he wore a clean shirt that looked like he'd actually ironed it. The sight of his obvious effort made something tender bloom in her chest. "You look beautiful," Quinton said as he helped her into the buggy, and Beatrice felt herself blush. "You look very handsome yourself." The ride to the ranch took about 30 minutes through gently rolling terrain dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cactus. Quinton pointed out landmarks as they drove, telling her stories about the land and the people who'd tried and failed to tame it. Beatrice found herself relaxing into the conversation, into the easy back and forth that seemed to come naturally when they were together. The ranch house was small but well built, a sturdy structure that looked like it had been made to last. There was a barn behind it, a corral with several horses, and in the distance, Beatrice could see cattle grazing. It wasn't grand, but it was clearly cared for, every fence straight and every building maintained. "It's not much," Quinton said, sounding almost apologetic, "but it's mine." "It's wonderful," Beatrice said honestly. "You built this yourself, mostly." "Had help with the barn, but the house I did myself." Quinton helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "Come on, I'll give you the tour before we eat." He showed her around with obvious pride, pointing out improvements he'd made and plans he had for expansion. Beatrice could hear the passion in his voice when he talked about the ranch, could see the dream he was building taking shape. It reminded her of how she felt about teaching, about building something meaningful from nothing. They ate on the porch, simple food that Quinton had clearly put effort into preparing. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from their childhoods to their dreams for the future to their opinions on everything from politics to literature. Beatrice was surprised to discover that Quinton was well-read, that his mother's insistence on education had left him with a love of books that matched her own. "I don't get much time to read anymore," Quinton admitted as they finished eating, "but I miss it. There's something about getting lost in a good story." "I could lend you books," Beatrice offered. "I managed to save quite a few from the accident and I'm always looking for someone to discuss them with." "I'd like that." Quinton stood and offered his hand. "Walk with me. I want to show you the sunset from the ridge." They walked together through the late afternoon light, Beatrice's hand tucked into the crook of Quinton's arm. He led her up a gentle slope to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the entire valley. From here, she could see Superior in the distance, the mountains rising beyond it, the vast sweep of desert stretching in every direction. "This is why I bought this land," Quinton said quietly. "The first time I saw this view, I knew I was home. I can see why." Beatrice turned to look at him instead of the view. "It's beautiful, Quinton. Everything you've built here is beautiful." He met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I found you that day on the road, even if the circumstances were terrible. I can't imagine not having met you now. I feel the same way." Beatrice's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You saved me in more ways than one that day." Quinton reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. "Can I kiss you?" Beatrice answered by closing the distance between them, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened into something that made her head spin and her heart race. Quinton's arms came around her waist, careful of her still healing ribs, and Beatrice wound her hands into his shirt, holding him close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinton rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you. Even when I was covered in dust and blood and half dead," Beatrice couldn't help teasing, "especially then." Quinton's smile was soft and genuine. "You were the bravest person I'd ever seen crawling out from under that wagon. I knew right then you were special." They stayed on the ridge until the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Beatrice thought that she'd never been happier than she was in this moment. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness. Beatrice threw herself into teaching, watching her students bloom under her guidance. She started the library she'd dreamed of, soliciting book donations from anyone who would contribute, and was thrilled when half the town participated. She organized spelling bees and reading contests, poetry recitations and math competitions, giving her students reasons to excel and opportunities to shine. And through it all, Quinton was there. He started coming to town every weekend, always with some excuse about needing supplies or checking on his accounts, but everyone knew he was really there to see Beatrice. They had dinner together every Saturday, sometimes at the restaurant in town, sometimes at his ranch where they could have privacy. They went on long walks through the desert, rode horses through the hills, spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Superior watched their courtship with fascination and approval. Beatrice had worried about gossip, about damage to her reputation, but Martha had been right. The town saw Quinton as a good man and Beatrice as a good woman, and they were happy to see two people who deserved happiness finding it together. By Christmas, Beatrice knew she was in love. She loved Quinton's quiet strength, his dry sense of humor, the way he listened when she talked about her students like their successes were his own. She loved how patient he was with her as she continued to heal from the accident, never pushing her beyond her limits. She loved how he'd somehow convinced the rest of the town to donate wood and nails so he could build new shelves for her library, and how he'd spent 3 weekends installing them himself. She loved him, simply and completely, and she was almost certain he loved her too, even though neither of them had said the words yet. On Christmas Eve, Quinton picked her up in the buggy as usual, but instead of heading to his ranch, he drove them out into the desert under a sky so full of stars it took her breath away. He'd brought blankets and hot coffee, and they sat together under the vast expanse of the universe, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting on his chest. "I have something for you," Quinton said after a while. He pulled a small box from his pocket and handed it to her with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a small turquoise pendant. It was beautiful, clearly carefully chosen, and Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. "Quinton, it's gorgeous." "Turquoise is supposed to bring protection and good fortune," Quinton said quietly. "I know it's probably just superstition, but after what happened with the wagon, I thought maybe you could use a little extra of both." Beatrice set the box aside carefully and turned to face him fully. "I love it. And I love you." The words hung in the air between them for a heartbeat, and then Quinton was kissing her with an intensity that made her forget about the cold night air, the distant sounds of the desert, everything but the feeling of his lips on hers and his arms holding her tight. "I love you too," he said when they finally broke apart. "I have since the day I met you. I know it's fast. I know we haven't known each other long, but Beatrice, you're everything I didn't know I was looking for. You're smart and brave and kind, and you make me want to be better than I am." "You're already better than you think you are." Beatrice touched his face gently. "You're the best man I've ever known, Quinton Irons. Then marry me." The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them back and couldn't contain them anymore. "I know it's soon. I know you probably want more time, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. Marry me, Beatrice. Build a life with me. Let me love you for the rest of our days." Beatrice's heart felt too big for her chest, swelling with so much joy she thought she might burst from it. "Yes. Yes, of course I'll marry you." Quinton let out a breath like he'd been holding it since he asked, and kissed her again under the stars. When Beatrice finally went home that night, the necklace around her neck and a ring on her finger that had belonged to Quinton's mother, she felt like she was floating. They were married in March of 1884, on a warm spring day with the desert blooming around them. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, packing the small church until people were standing in the aisles. Martha cried through the entire service. Dr. Chen looked smug, like she'd known all along how things would turn out. Harold Peterson gave a touching speech about love and learning and second chances. But Beatrice only had eyes for Quinton, standing at the altar in his best suit with his hair freshly cut and his eyes shining with love. When he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and when she said hers, she meant every single word with her whole heart. They honeymooned at the ranch, which Beatrice now thought of as their ranch, not just his. Quinton had spent the past month making improvements, adding rooms to the small house and building furniture with his own hands. There was a study for Beatrice filled with books and a comfortable chair for reading. There was a workshop for Quinton where he could work on projects during the winter. There was a bedroom with a big window facing east so they could watch the sunrise together every morning. "It's perfect," Beatrice said as Quinton carried her over the threshold, laughing when he refused to set her down even after they were inside. "You've thought of everything. I want you to be happy here." Quinton finally set her on her feet but kept his arms around her waist. "I want this to feel like home. Anywhere with you is home." Beatrice kissed him softly. "You're my home, Quinton." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Beatrice continued teaching, her students thriving under her care. She expanded the library, started adult education classes in the evening for people who'd never learned to read. She wrote letters to publishers begging for donated books, to universities asking for old textbooks, to anyone who might help her bring more education to Superior. Quinton expanded the ranch, buying more cattle and hiring 2 more hands to help manage them. He built a bigger barn, improved the house further, slowly turning his dream into reality. But he always made time for Beatrice, always came home for dinner, always asked about her day and listened like her work was just as important as his. They were happy, deliriously so, and Beatrice often found herself thinking back to that day on the road when the wagon had crushed her. If someone had told her then that her disaster would lead to this, to love and purpose and a home she'd built with her own hands, she never would have believed it. But here she was, living proof that sometimes the worst moments of your life can lead to the best. In December of 1884, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been sure until Dr. Chen confirmed it, and even then she'd barely been able to believe it. She told Quinton that night over dinner, watching as comprehension dawned on his face followed by pure joy. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to have a baby. We are." Beatrice laughed as Quinton swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen. "Careful, you'll make me dizzy. I don't care, I'm too happy to care." Quinton set her down but kept his hands on her waist, his eyes searching her face. "Are you happy? Is this what you want?" "It's everything I want." Beatrice placed her hands over his. "A family with you. A life we build together. What more could I possibly want?" Their son was born in July of 1885, arriving 2 weeks early on a sweltering summer day that had Beatrice cursing the heat and Quinton pacing holes in the floor while Dr. Chen worked. But when she finally placed the baby in Beatrice's arms, all the pain and fear melted away into pure love. "He's perfect," Beatrice whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. "He's amazing." Quinton sat beside her on the bed, staring at their son with awe. "What should we name him?" They discussed names for months but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her son's tiny face, Beatrice thought of Quinton's mother who'd insisted on education, who'd set her son on the path that led to this moment. "What was your mother's maiden name?" she asked. "Morrison." "Why?" "Morrison Irons." Beatrice tested the name. "What do you think?" Quinton's eyes went bright with unshed tears. "I think my mother would have loved that, and I think she would have loved you." "Then Morrison it is." Beatrice took a year off from teaching to care for Morrison, though she kept up with her library work and her adult education classes in the evenings when Quinton could watch the baby. She loved being a mother, loved watching her son grow and change, loved seeing pieces of both her and Quinton in his expressions and mannerisms. When Morrison was a year old, Beatrice returned to teaching part-time, and Martha Peterson offered to watch the baby during school hours. The arrangement worked beautifully, and Beatrice was grateful to be able to continue the work she loved while also being present for her son. In the spring of 1887, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news felt less shocking, more like a natural next step. Their daughter, Sarah, was born that November, named for Dr. Chen, who'd become not just their doctor but their friend. Sarah was completely different from Morrison, where he'd been a calm baby. She was energetic and demanding, keeping them up at all hours and requiring constant attention. But Beatrice and Quinton navigated it together, taking turns with night feedings, supporting each other through the exhaustion. "I don't know how my mother did this alone after my father died," Beatrice said one night after finally getting Sarah back to sleep. She collapsed onto the bed beside Quinton, too tired to even change into her nightgown. "2 children feels impossible some days. You're doing an amazing job." Quinton pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You're an amazing mother and an amazing teacher and an amazing wife." "I don't know how I got so lucky." "We both got lucky," Beatrice corrected, snuggling into his warmth. "That day on the road when you found me, that was the luckiest day of both our lives. Can't argue with that." Quinton's hand came up to play with the turquoise necklace she still wore every day. "Best decision I ever made, stopping to help." The years that followed were full and rich. Morrison started school when he turned 6, sitting in his mother's classroom and making her proud with how quickly he learned. Sarah followed 2 years later, just as bright as her brother but with a mischievous streak that kept everyone on their toes. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Quinton bought more land, expanded the herd, built a second barn. He hired more hands, good men who were loyal and hardworking, and slowly became not just their employer but their friend. Beatrice's school became known throughout the territory for its excellence. Former students went on to university, to professional careers, to lives they never could have imagined without the education she'd given them. The library grew to over 500 books, and Beatrice started holding monthly reading groups that became social events for the entire town. Superior itself changed around them, growing from a rough mining town into a real community with churches and schools and civic organizations. The mine continued to produce silver, bringing prosperity that benefited everyone. New families moved in, drawn by the opportunities and the reputation of the excellent school. Through it all, Beatrice and Quinton's love only grew stronger. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of frustration and misunderstanding that come with any marriage. But they always talked through their problems, always chose each other, always remembered what they'd built together and why it mattered. On their 10th wedding anniversary in March of 1894, Quinton surprised Beatrice with a trip back to the spot where he'd proposed, that same rocky outcropping overlooking the valley. They left Morrison and Sarah with Martha, packed a picnic dinner, and rode out together as the sun began to set. "I can't believe it's been 10 years, Beatrice said as they sat together watching the sky turn colors. "It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. Best 10 years of my life." Quinton pulled her closer. "You know what I think about sometimes? That day I found you under the wagon. What if I'd been an hour later? What if I'd taken a different road? What if I'd decided not to stop? But you did stop." Beatrice turned to look at him. "You saved me, and not just my life. You saved me from a future of being alone, of never knowing what it felt like to be truly loved. You gave me everything, Quinton. You gave me everything, too." Quinton kissed her softly. "A home, a family, a reason to build something that matters. Before you, I was just going through the motions, surviving but not really living. You taught me the difference." They sat together until the stars came out, talking about the past and dreaming about the future. Morrison would be going to university in a few years if he kept up his current trajectory. Sarah wanted to be a teacher like her mother. The ranch was doing well enough that Quinton was thinking about buying the adjacent property and expanding further. "We've built a good life," Beatrice said as they finally packed up to head home. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. The best life." Quinton helped her onto her horse, then mounted his own. "And it's only going to get better from here." He was right. The years continued to bring blessings. Morrison did go to university, studying engineering at a school in California, and came back with new ideas about irrigation that helped not just their ranch but the entire region. Sarah became a teacher, taking over some of Beatrice's classes as her mother gradually reduced her workload. In 1902, Morrison married a lovely young woman named Clara whom he'd met at university, and they gave Beatrice and Quinton their first grandchild the following year. Sarah married in 1905 to a doctor who'd come to Superior to work with Dr. Chen, who was finally ready to train a successor. Beatrice officially retired from teaching in 1907 at the age of 50, though she continued to run the library and mentor new teachers. Quinton gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Morrison, though he still rode out every morning to check on the cattle and make sure everything was running smoothly. They grew old together, their hair turning silver, their faces lining with the evidence of years spent smiling. They had 4 grandchildren eventually, and later 3 great-grandchildren, and their home was always full of family and laughter and love. On a warm October evening in 1923, 40 years after that fateful day on the road, Beatrice and Quinton sat together on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset. They were in their 70s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and devoted to each other. "Do you remember the day we met?" Beatrice asked, her hand clasped in Quinton's. "Every detail." Quinton's voice was rougher now with age but still warm and sure. "The way you looked trapped under that wagon, so brave even though you were terrified. The way you held on to me as we rode to town. The way you thanked me even though you could barely breathe." "I think I started falling in love with you that day," Beatrice admitted. "I just didn't know it yet. I knew." Quinton smiled at her. "The moment I lifted that wagon off you and saw you were going to be okay, I knew my life had just changed forever. I just had to convince you to give me a chance. Best decision I ever made." Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder. "Saying yes to you, to this life, to everything we built together. I wouldn't change a single thing. Neither would I." Quinton kissed the top of her head. "You're still the bravest person I know, Beatrice Irons. Still the love of my life. Still the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat together as the sun set over the desert they both loved, over the land they'd worked together, over the community they'd helped build. Inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren playing, could smell dinner cooking, could feel the warmth of the family they'd created. It had all started with a disaster, with a wagon overturned and a woman trapped, with a cowboy who'd stopped to help when he could have ridden on by. But that disaster had led to this, to a love that had lasted 4 decades and would last until their final days, to a legacy of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to a life so full of joy and purpose that neither of them could have imagined it in their wildest dreams. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, Beatrice squeezed Quinton's hand and felt him squeeze back, the same silent promise they'd been making to each other for 40 years. "I'm here. I love you. Forever." And they were, and they did, until the very end and beyond, two souls who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. Their story became legend in Superior, the tale of the teacher and the cowboy who'd fallen in love after a wagon accident, who'd built a life of love and purpose and family that inspired generations. The library Beatrice had started still stood, expanded now into a full community center. The school she'd taught in had been replaced by a larger, modern building, but her portrait hung in the entrance hall, reminding students of the woman who'd believed in the power of education to change lives. The ranch Quinton had built from nothing was still thriving, run now by his great-grandchildren, a testament to hard work and dedication. And on summer evenings, if you stood on that rocky outcropping overlooking the valley, you could almost feel their presence, could almost hear their laughter carried on the desert wind, could almost see two figures sitting together watching the sunset, hands clasped and hearts intertwined, love eternal as the stars above and the land below. It was a good life, the best life, built on a foundation of courage and kindness, and a cowboy who'd stopped to help when it mattered most. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for, to build something that matters with someone we love, to leave the world a little better than we found it, to love and be loved in return until our last breath and beyond. Beatrice and Quinton did exactly that, and their story lived on, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that one act of kindness can change everything. Their tombstones stood side by side in the Superior Cemetery, simple markers that read Beatrice Whitmore Irons, beloved teacher, wife, mother, and Quinton Irons, devoted husband, father, rancher. But those who knew them, who'd heard their story, knew the truth of who they were. They were proof that love conquers all, that courage comes in many forms, that building a life together is the greatest adventure of all. They were Superior's heart, the example everyone aspired to, the reminder that goodness and dedication and love can create ripples that last for generations. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, they were still together, still holding hands, still watching sunsets and dreaming dreams and loving each other with everything they had. Because love like theirs doesn't end with death. It transcends it, becomes eternal, becomes the stuff of legends and lullabies and stories told to grandchildren on warm summer nights. The wagon had overturned. The cowboy had stopped to help. And from that moment forward, everything changed for both of them, for their children, for Superior itself. One moment of choice, one act of heroism, one decision to lift that wagon and check her for injuries instead of riding on by. That's all it took to change the world, at least the world of two people who found in each other everything they'd been searching for, without knowing they were searching at all. And in the end, that's the truest measure of a life well lived, not in riches or fame or grand accomplishments, but in love given and received, in lives touched and changed, in a legacy that endures long after we're gone. Beatrice and Quinton left that legacy. They built it together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love at a time. And Superior remembered, would always remember, the teacher and the cowboy who showed them all what true love looked like, what a life of purpose and meaning could be, what it meant to build something that mattered with someone who mattered more than anything else in the world. Their story ended not with tragedy but with triumph, not with sorrow but with joy, not with an ending at all but with a continuation, as their love lived on in their descendants, in the institutions they'd built, in the very soil of the desert they'd called home. And that, perhaps, is the greatest love story of all, the one that never truly ends, the one that echoes through time, reminding us all that love is the greatest adventure, the finest achievement, the most precious gift we can ever give or receive. And that sometimes, just sometimes, being trapped under an overturned wagon is exactly where you need to be to find the love of your life waiting to lift you free.